Telega Boulevard, I believe.
Hey, 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 Sharon, Sharon, Sharon. This is delegatory. Look, I'm gonna recommend that members hold their questions until we get to the end of the presentation. I find that it's a lot more effective to allow the secretary to give his presentation, and then we can take questions at the end. Okay. Thank you.
Sharon, I can hear him.
Hear him.
No, I'm not.
Yeah.
I can hear him.
Okay, you good? Okay, I'll start over again. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our House Appropriations Committee meeting. We're going to have our economic and review update from Secretary Layne. Topics to be covered are the national and state economic indicators, April year to date, revenue collections for fiscal year 2020. Secretary Layne is going to talk to us about some next steps and also about the federal stimulus funds. But before we get started with Secretary Layne, Sharon, would you kindly do a roll call, please?
Present.
Here.
Here.
Here. Present.
Here.
Present.
Present. Present. Present. Present. Here. 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 Present. Here. Here. Here.
Here.
Everybody is present, Mr. Chair.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sharon. Secretary Layne, we welcome you and thank you so very much for coming to share with us today. I'm going to ask the members to do two things for me, to mute their phones or just have everything on mute, and also reserve your questions until the Secretary gets to the end of his presentation. Secretary Layne, welcome, and the meeting is in your hands, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate being here today. And as a 64-year-old technology-challenged individual, I appreciate all your team's work getting this set up for me. What I plan to do is to go through the topics that you talked about this morning, but also may add a little bit about the upcoming forecasting process that will probably be coming here in the next 60 to 90 days. Now, this clicker still, okay, I can't get it to move. Try the left side. Nope. Point at the laptop. Nope, can't get the clicker to move here, guys. Okay, so let's see if I can do that. Nope. Should work now. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so as we mentioned, the topics we'll discuss is just a little bit about forecasting, and let's get right into the national and state economic indicators. I typically don't go through these in much detail, but since we haven't met in a while, and I think they're going to be very key to our upcoming forecast, I thought I'd take a few minutes to put a little color behind some of these. The first thing I should point out in the first bullet is this is the first monthly report that contain the effects of COVID-19 and the closings on our revenues. They will include the general economic downturn, and I would point out that even with the April results, we still don't have a totally full month of those results, but they certainly have impacted us. And also, the most significant impact was the governor's decision to defer April and May income tax payments, what we normally do on May 1st until June 1st, because that took a lot of the revenues that we would have gotten out of late April and put them into late May and early June. So that is going to be probably the primary issue or point to make during this presentation is that we do have the impacts of the virus, but something that we chose to do by deferring tax payments was really the real reason why our revenues were down 26% or $700 million for the month. Now, according to estimates, and on the national level, we've all seen the headlines. Obviously, gross domestic product fell in the first quarter because we were impacted in late March, but it was only down about 5%, 4.8%. We expect that to accelerate in the second quarter, our last year, a fiscal quarter, from April through June to be almost 36, 37% down. So that's a pretty significant downward decline in economic activity. And what we've seen at the nation is also going to be present here in Virginia. We've talked about, you've seen the headlines for payroll unemployment going up significantly, well over now 25 million to 30 million jobs lost at the national level. The last most recent jobs report on May the 9th at the federal level, or the national level, were down 3 million. And of course, that's significantly down from the previous few weeks, but still almost 30 million people are out of work now that weren't out of work about 45 to 50 days ago. That has pushed the national unemployment rate up at the end of April, 14.7%, but as of the week ending May 2nd, it was up to 15.7%. Many economists expect that to maybe get up into the low 20s before we actually hit bottom. And as I pointed out, initial claims for unemployment are going down, but still at 3 million level, that's obviously something that is very significant decline in economic activity in our country. Now, what's also going to be important to us, I think more important than these numbers that are looking backwards, are the numbers that are going to look forward, particularly as we get into forecasting, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But consumer confidence is going to be key for us to see where we're going to end up. And if you look at one of the bottom bullets there, the consumer confidence fell again in April. And the key for us is going to be, when is that going to turn around? Because public confidence is going to be the key to the economic turnaround, not only in the nation, but in the Commonwealth here. And so if you look at where we stand now, it's started to rebound just a little bit with the hopes of a vaccine. With the opening up this past Friday, not only that Virginia is starting to open up, but other states across the country starting to open up. Public confidence is starting to creep up a little bit. Hopefully that'll be the bottom. And hopefully we won't have political backlash at the national level that could cause this public confidence to begin going the other way. And I'll get more into that a little bit later. One thing I should also point out here, while it's important in public confidence, the stock market is not the real economy. And Mr. Chairman, we should have a meeting like this every day because the stock market opened up 700 points or so this morning. But I want to point out that may help consumer confidence, but it's really not what's going on Main Street in our economy. And that's because the stock market is looking somewhere 12 to 18 months ahead. Not looking at what's happening now. That may be good for helping us in forecasting. It may be good for helping us in looking at consumer confidence, but it is not so telling of what's really going on in the economy. Now, when we take a look at what's happening here in Virginia, we had our unemployment rate rose to 3.3% at the end of March, but I today believe we're just north of 10%. We're a couple points better than the national environment. We've had over 670,000 unemployment claims in the Commonwealth since this has started. So our best estimate right now is we're a little bit over 10%. Now, a couple of things can help us and as the nation as we go forward, and some of the things that the Federal Reserve has done and the fiscal policy coming out of Washington have helped quite a bit in this. If you go back up at the last Federal Reserve meeting, interest rates were left at 0 to 0.25%. And that's going to be that way, most economists believe, for the next 2 to 3 years as it takes some time to work out of this. But what's very important also is that the Federal Reserve has opened up the money supply. Quantitative easing, which is a technical term to mean they are buying all kinds of debts, whether it be municipal debt, whether it be not individual, but corporate debt, and they're flooding the economy with money to keep this from not only becoming a public health crisis and an economic crisis, but a financial structured crisis. So they're keeping the banks pretty liquid to keep all the markets going, and that's going to be very helpful to us, and I think a key as to why we're starting to see some elements of coming back to life in the economy because of the actions that the Federal Reserve has taken. So that's going to be key for the nation, key for us. And finally, if you look at some of our specific leading index at the bottom of the page, and I'll get to this a little bit later, but auto registrations have dropped significantly. People have stopped buying automobiles, and that's going to be evident in vehicle miles traveled and our sales tax, vehicle tax collections as we get later on in the presentation. So overall, in terms of the national and where we are at the state, I think we're getting closer to a bottom. We may not be at a bottom, but we're much closer to the bottom than where we were when this thing started about 45 or 50 days ago. And that's, again, going to be very important as a base for our future economic forecast, and I'll come to that in just a few minutes. Now, if we look at the month in total, general fund revenue collections, as I said, we're down $700 million. The most significant reason for that was because we moved the tax payment date from May 1st to June 1st, and we didn't get all those collections in late April. In fact, all of it, and I'll get to this in non-withholding, was down $760 million for the month. So all the loss could be attributed to that one item. Now, that doesn't mean that everything else was going along just great, but in general, economic activity in the Commonwealth fared better than what we were predicting. And I will say, when we came out a month or so ago and suggested we were going to lose about $1 billion in the fourth quarter, that looks like we're well within those parameters to stay within that. Hopefully we'll trend a little bit better, but I still believe that the $1 billion is a good estimate of where we will be in not only this current fiscal year, but in our fourth quarter in that. So key to point out here is this is through 10 months now. At the end of April, we are still positive by 1.4% compared to last year. I was on the phone with rating agencies last week, and this looks like we've fared a little better than some of the other states, particularly our neighbors. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact not only has the consumer continued to spend because of the money that the federal authorities, the fiscal policy, put direct payments to individuals, the unemployment benefits have held up, but also I think it has to do with our economy in Virginia. It was very strong going in. We're still the federal government is still open. That's a large employer for us. Our defense industry is still going. That was an essential part, and they did not close, particularly the shipyards in Hampton Roads. Our technology sector has been able to work from home. So while we have felt the impact, and certainly there are some areas like lodging and tourism and restaurants that have been significantly hard hit, I want to point out that we still do have economic activity in the Commonwealth, and hopefully that will be a good base for us to build on as we help some of these other industries open up over the next few months. So when we get into the individual details, growth in withholding tax collections actually held up pretty well for the month. Now, part of this has to do with what I just commented on, that the federal government employees are still working and our defense spending is still strong, and I mentioned about technology. But it also, we were helped by the calendar. There were 2 more deposit days that happened in April that would have normally, now going to happen, we're going to pay for in the next month in May. So we're going to have to look at April, May together. I estimate that we would be down between 5 and 6% for the month in withholding had it not been for those 2 deposit days. And we'll get the real answer to that here by the end of this month. But even a decline of 4 to 5 to 6% in withholding still was a positive sign to us compared to other states. It's not good overall, I get that, but it looks like we're holding up okay as we look at withholding tax collections. And I'll have a forecast, an update to our projections at the end of this for the year, and I'll take you through how I think we're going to end up over the next couple of months or as we finish out our year. But where we stand right now, again, a good sign is we are right on our projections with 2 months to go. So again, that helps me give some confidence that the $1 billion we might potentially lose, we're well within that based on at least the first look of April collections, the first month in our fourth quarter. Now, here's the real story that I started with, and this is the non-withholding tax collections. These are primarily payment of income taxes from the previous year and estimates for the current year. And as I mentioned before, they've all now been delayed till either June 1st for the income tax payments and June 15th for the estimates for the second quarter, our fourth quarter of this year. So we were down in this category by $760 million, more than offset the loss, the entire loss for the month. Now, I know that we're going to get some of this back because this year, in the month of April, we only processed 260,000 tax returns. Last year, we processed 540,000 tax returns, meaning that most people are going to pay us when the taxes are due, June the 1st. So that gives me some confidence that not only is this a problem for the month, but it's a timing issue. We're going to recoup some of this. Now, let me also point out, before all this COVID-19 situation happened, we were concerned in this particular area because of the impacts of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from the previous year. We were concerned that would we see the same type of activity in the quarter. And in fact, we actually planned to be down $500 million to last year. Our projections are planned to be down $500 million. Now, if you go to the graph and look at the April month, that large green bar was last year, and you'll see just to the right of it a red star. And you'll see that red star again in May on the yellow line and again in June on the yellow line. If you were to go back and look at last month's projections, that's where we would have thought the revenues would have come in. We were anticipating $930 million for the month. We only got $470 because of the timing. But what we anticipate will be about the same as our projections this month, but we're anticipating a lot of that come in late May and June, and you can see that we're expecting our June collections to go up because that's now when the tax payments are due. So in other words, we have shifted the monies received in this category from April to late May and June. But I wanted to give you an analysis of where we were. Had we not shifted the date and we only collected $470 million, I'd have been much more concerned. But that's not what's happening here. It's just a matter, and again, when we're going to receive the monies, and again, a lot of that has to do with, I know people haven't filed their returns because we only processed less than half than we did a year ago this time. So this is going to be the key. And as you recall, I've been sharing you with this graph. The lines on here are comparing us to 2013 and 2014. In 2013, we had because of some tax changes, had a large receipt of monies, and then it didn't repeat itself in 14. We were projecting this year not to get as much, but of course now, if you look at the dotted line, that's the current year. We are way down because we moved the tax date to June 1st. The question is, are we going to rebound? But we don't have to rebound as much as we did in the prior year because our projections already were reduced by $500 million because of what we expected to be the tax impacts. In fact, before we went into this, you'll remind the last reviews we had, I was sharing you that we had an upward bias in this category. I was feeling comfortable that we might actually get more money. We wouldn't lose that whole $500 million. So when you take that into account, plus the fact that we moved the tax deadline, comfortable that we're going to recoup a lot of these monies in late May and early June, and that's going to be key to us staying within the $1 billion that we've estimated loss for the current fiscal year, or doing slightly better than that. Now, one other area that we've been monitoring closely are individual income tax refunds. And even though we moved the tax filing date from May to June, or tax payment date also, anybody that was due a refund, you would expect them to file as quickly as they could, because obviously they need the monies going forward. And we have noticed that our refunds are staying about consistent with last year. Now, that may be not great news for our taxpayers if you're having not to get as large a refund, but it's good news for tax revenues from our perspective here. And in fact, this year we processed 490,000 refunds versus 730,000 in the prior year. So that may bode well in terms of our tax collections, that most people who are probably going to be due a refund have already filed or are in the process of filing. So again, another thing to say that probably we have an upward bias to a positive bias in individual income tax, not only receipts, but in refunds going forward. So that being the case, again, I feel comfortable that we're well within this $1 billion loss that we were expecting in the fourth quarter, and a large part of that has to do with income taxes. Individuals, as you know, that's over 70% of our collections in that revenue source. But another revenue source that also held up well for the month was sales tax collections. We were only down less than 0.5%. And a lot of that had to do with, again, online sales, right? Thankfully, we had the Wayfair legislation, and that has kept online sales strong in the Commonwealth. And in fact, one of the things I think whenever this pandemic is going to hasten, unfortunately, for some of the sticks and bricks retailers, is a shift away from them more so to online, because people are continuing to buy online. Now, there were a couple of other things that helped us. Food sales in grocery stores held up well. While we lost them in restaurants because they were closed, people shifted over to the grocery stores. And in fact, there was probably some hoarding going on during that period. The question will be whether that's sustainable or not. But that was a very positive point for us in sales tax collections during the month. On top of that, our ABC sales were strong. And that's not just in the ABC sales in our stores, but also when the governor's ruling to allow other restaurants to have ABC sold off. So those two items between food and ABC stores helped buoy this particular revenue source. And also I'll point out that the quick action, again, by the federal authorities for those direct checks to individuals and unemployment benefits have given consumers confidence that they have continued to spend at least on necessities as we go forward. So the question will be, will this continue? But as we stand to date, again, we're pretty much right on where we wanted to be. We're up 7.4% for the year. So again, almost 20% of our revenues come from sales taxes, and they're right on our projection going into the last 2 months of the year. So that sets us up with our two largest revenue sources of individual taxes and sales taxes being on plan for the year and staying within the $1 billion that we projected that we could lose because of the effects of the virus in the fourth quarter, now the last 2 months of the year. Net corporate income tax collections were also down, but again, this has to do with the timing of when those taxes are due. They're not now due until July the 1st. So we've actually had a drop in actual payers. We'll see if we get some of that back, but it looks as if we are going to get some of that because they simply haven't filed their returns going forward. Another bright spot that I think is going to continue is recordation taxes. As I mentioned earlier, interest rates are at historic lows. That has also refinancings are now 70 to 80% a part of this. Not so much new home sales, but refinancings. And that looks like it's going to continue. People were refinancing initially for a lower interest rate. Now are doing that, also looking to pull some equity out of their homes to tide them over during this crisis. So it looks like recordation taxes with low interest rates are going to hold up. not only through this month, but for the foreseeable future. And again, it was up 25% for the year, and I expect that will continue. Insurance premiums were also fine for the month. However, I'll put one word of caution here. If you've been watching TV, you've noticed companies like Geico and State Farm talk about rebating some of their premiums in the future. This revenue source is simply the amount of premiums paid times a percentage that the state collects. If they rebate those in the future, I suspect this revenue source will be impacted, and we'll have to take that into account when we do our forecast going forward. But for the current fiscal year, we're pretty much on track. So what does all this mean? This means that after 10 months, we're right on our projections, at least as compared, we're still up to last year. And this slide tells us that we would have to increase 9.3% for the next 2 months to meet our budget, not our reduced budget, but our budget. And last year we increased 10.7%. I don't think we're going to do that. I've said I think we're going to be somewhere within about $1 billion off. And so on this next slide, that's what I've calculated for you. You can see here that we can be down roughly 12% for the next 2 months and still make our revenue collections within the $1 billion. What that potentially means is that we will about break even. I expect we're going to lose money in withholding, but pick up a little bit in non-withholding. But where we're not going to be able to pick up is in sales tax and corporate taxes. I'm expecting us to continue to lose there. And if we're down about $700 million now, I think we're going to be well within that $1 billion as we go forward, at least as we sit here today looking at the numbers. Now, I want to talk a little bit here about forecasting and projections. As you recall, back in early March when the General Assembly was convening is when all this hit. And there were calls at that time, and maybe rightly so, but there were calls that we should immediately do a reforecast. And of course, our response is we weren't sure what we would reforecast off of because we've never seen something like this, at least in modern history. And even in the Great Depression, things didn't stop as immediately as they have with this pandemic. It was about risk versus uncertainty. Risk is something that you can model and quantify. Uncertainty is something you have no idea about, and you have no other choice but to pick the most pessimistic case. And in fact, I'll use a couple of examples as to how this is played out with some of our neighbors. As you recall, during this time, Maryland came out and said they were going to lose $2.8 billion from that point forward to the end of their fiscal year. Now they've since adjusted that and come back and said, no, that's going to be more like $1 billion. Again, more like what we said we would call for here in Virginia in that. So one of the problems with reforecasting without knowing a lot of data is that you have to reforecast as that data changes. And that's what's happened in Maryland. They were very pessimistic. It now turned out for other reasons that they didn't need to be that pessimistic. So I'm very comfortable with the approach we've taken to suspend all discretionary spending, to free up our reserves, to suspend or unallot all the new spending until we get to a new reforecast. Because I've read online, you've got some very bloggers and others that are very pessimistic because it fits their view. You have some that are very optimistic because it fits their view. If you look at Moody's or S&P or any of the national economic models, you can pick the one that you best like. But the real key will be what it is are the good factors that we can reforecast on. We need to know how deep this recession is going to be. It looks like to me we're getting pretty close to understanding that. We need to know how long this is going to last. We've now seen the economy start to open up, not just here in Virginia, but across the country. So we're going to have, over the next 60 days, more data in that. And also, we've now seen federal action. But a few months ago, No one knew about the federal fiscal action that the feds were going to take. No one knew about the federal authorities at the Federal Reserve and the quantitative easing, the amount of money they put in the economy. And their actions forward are also going to be very important, not simply because of the states getting more money, but if they are going to continue to support the consumer and businesses with their current programs, that will lessen the severity of this downturn. So we're starting to see some of the data points that when we get back here, or when you guys get back here in the next 60 to 70 days, and I'm assuming that's going to be about the time, maybe a little bit longer than that, 90 days, we'll get year-end numbers, and we'll get to see some more of these data points, and hopefully then we will then be able to project off and forecast off good data. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be positive. We very well may get to have to take other actions, but at least it'll be based on data points that are specific to us and real things that we can start to discern by adding some probabilities to instead of the total uncertainty of putting a number out there would have been just a guess. So I'm very much comfortable that as when we get to this reforecast, not it's going to be good or bad, but we're going to have good data to use for that in going forward. The reason we came out with $1 billion in this year and in the next 2 years, the only data point I could point to was last year's forecast, where our pessimistic for a moderate recession was at least $1 billion down. But at least it was based on some facts and not just simply some finger in the air estimate. So I think also as we go forward here, we're going to be able to have a better forecast in the next few months than we would have. Again, it may not necessarily be what everybody wants to see, but it will feel comfortable that we can take appropriate actions on. So as we look at our next steps, we'll be looking at the individual income tax refunds for the next 2 months and also payments for the next 2 months, both in withholding and sales taxes, and certainly looking at where our final payment of taxes come in the month of June. One word of caution I want to point out here, though, is the final bullet on this page, where it says a significant number of waivers from businesses for payment of their accelerated sales tax is expected. There are many companies that will have taxes that are due this year a lot less than last year. And as you recall, any company over $10 million in annual sales has to take an estimate of their last year's sales and pay us in this June. Well, I suspect we're going to get a lot of waivers from that. There's roughly $337 million that comes in the month of June related to this accelerated sales tax. I'm comfortable, retailers that are grocers, Amazon, the big box, they're going to be fine, but there are going to be some others that are going to ask for waivers. And that's one of their conditions they can do that. And one of the things that allows them to do that is significantly less revenue this year than last year. And some are going to be able to prove that. So that's one other source we're going to have to be looking at. A couple of other comments, and I'll get into the CARES funding. The lottery proceeds for the month were down $7 million. We're down over $41 million for the year. We're starting to see that impact not only from games of skill, but just the economy in general. We've worked with the lottery people to come up with a forecast. I'm sure that's going to be lesser as we move forward. And one quick thing, I mentioned earlier about auto registrations. Motor vehicle sales and use tax were down $40 million for the month, or 41% for the month. In other words, remember, auto sales were going great. They have now stopped. Now, the question will be when they're going to rebound. But we're going to have issues not just in the general fund, but with non-general fund revenues. And I think a lot of that's going to have to be, as we go read through and forecast, it'll not just be the general fund, but transportation and other items we're going to have to take a look at. I'll also point out I monitor our cash balances on a weekly basis. We currently are sitting with about $13.5 billion in cash. 4.7 of that is unrestricted. That number has not changed significantly since this happened. So I'm very comfortable with our current cash position. We monitor this weekly, and we'll see how that goes as we move forward. But right now, I can confirm our cash balances remain strong and pretty consistent even before this happened going forward. Now, that concludes a little bit, and I'll take questions after this regarding the monthly numbers. I want to talk a little bit about the federal stimulus funds that Virginia has received and is expected to receive. First of all, let me point out that our state actions are dictated by federal actions. In other words, there's a lot of announcements that come out of the federal authorities, but we're maybe weeks or sometimes even months later in getting the guidance on how to spend those monies going forward. So I point that out is because there's a lot of publicity and the public and you guys see a lot of information, but it hasn't been given us the guidance. And so as soon as we get that guidance, we move forward as quickly as we can. So to date, the federal government has enacted 4 separate stimulus bills. And there's another one the House just passed, a $3 trillion bill. I don't believe that's going to become law, called the HEROES Act. But that is out there. We'll see if that's going to be forthcoming. Something of relative importance to us in that is that there would be additional monies coming directly to the states and localities that could be used for revenue replacement. Right now, any of the funds that we have received cannot be used for revenue replacement. And that's one of the things we've asked for, a little more flexibility. The most recent one that was passed, there was a $25 billion amount for testing. $11 billion of that was coming directly to the states. We have received no information of yet as to what our share of that is. Even though it's been out there for several weeks, we still have received no guidance on that. Now, probably the one that gets the most attention from us is the CARES Act. We got $3.3 billion from that. But there are other revenue streams for almost over 60 of them for additional monies that in total to date directly coming through the state is about $6.1 billion. Although most of those outside of the CARES money are for specific uses. We just monitor them, they come in and they go out. There's not a whole lot of discretion with those monies. There's much more discretion with the CARES monies, with the exception is they can't be used for revenue replacement. And of the $3.3 billion, $1.8 billion was designated for the state, $1.5 for the state to help local governments. I should point out here, though, there is no requirement, but that means direct payments to localities. It was just monies given to the state to help out localities. Now, we've chosen, and I'll get to those actions later, to give some of those directly to localities, but there is no mandate that it go directly to localities, with the exception of those localities over $500,000 could receive funding directly from the feds, and Fairfax was the only one in the Commonwealth where that applied to, and they got their $200 million directly from the federal authorities. As I mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty around this. We get conflicting guidelines from the Office of Management and Budget and from the Treasury Department. Sometimes we'll get guidance that is in direct conflict with it. Now, those are the monies that flow directly to us. Over and above that, there are different federal funds that are going to businesses and individuals in the Commonwealth. About $21 billion, of which about $14 billion is from the Paycheck Protection Program, and then another $7 million, the Municipal Liquidity Facility, where localities can borrow directly from the Federal Reserve. And in the budget actions you guys approve when you're up here during the reconvene session, we do have the ability to access that facility if we want to. I don't believe we're going to need to. You can only access it if you can't get monies from anywhere else. You have to certify to that. I believe we're going to be well within the reserves we have if this opens up the way it looks like it is over the next several months. And of course, we've been working directly with your House Appropriations team, along with Senate Finance and Appropriation teams. As we've gotten these funds, we discuss with them the various uses and how we go about getting those available to not only our agencies, but to some localities. Now, what I've listed for you over the next slides are simply a listing of all the different revenue streams and the different that have come to date. This is not all inclusive. There are others that come in here, but I wanted you to see, as we can identify these streams of monies, we are looking at them, working with the agencies, making sure not only are they in compliance with the guidelines, but wherever there is discretion, that the governor, the policy team, us working with your teams, have guidance given to the agencies on whether or how those monies are to be used. So that's just gives you a total of the different revenue streams that are coming in, but I wanted you to have comfort that they're being looked at not only by the executive branch, but in consultation. Not that your teams are signing off, I'm not suggesting that, but we are working with them. So I'm not trying to pass the buck in any way, but I want to let you know it is a collaborative effort that we're working with to keeping your teams informed. In fact, here is a slide that tells you the actions we've taken to date. As I mentioned, on the CARES funding, we sent out instructions to agencies on May the 7th, and those agency requests for the $1.8 billion here directly coming to the state are due today, and they will be received, and the policy team will be working with the agencies and the governor's office to come up with allocations for those funds. I can tell you, we have many more requests than we have monies. I've been meeting with individuals, and even though I say agencies, these do include outside requests. We've received lots of letters from individuals and particular organizations, and just like our budget requests, they will significantly exceed the amount of monies that we have. Over and above that, on May the 12th, a communication went out to all the localities in the Commonwealth that said we were going to give them roughly $645 million directly of CARES funding to use for their purposes at the local level in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Their certification that they signed for the use of the monies was the same thing the governor signed on behalf of the Commonwealth to receive the monies. You should know that if a locality does not use the monies correctly, it is the state that is on the hook to pay for those monies. So therefore, we had them do a certification, and also part of that certification is we have the right of offset to reduce other funding to them if these monies are not used in compliance with the guidelines. But we thought it was important to get monies to them very quickly because they've had obviously eligible expenses for PPE, personal protection equipment, and other items. We wanted to get them out quickly. And that amount, we've already spent to date roughly $121 million that we've authorized under the review from the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. It's primarily for the personal protection equipment and testing. Roughly $42 million of that amount is for testing. And I expect that number to go up significantly because we're now entertaining the additional testing in the Commonwealth plus contract tracing going forward. This does not include private testing reimbursement that we're expecting to get, nor the National Guard expenses, which are paid through another revenue stream for the testing going on. The other federal stimulus funds, I pointed out to you those various streams. You can see here about $55 million has been gone through so far to agencies, whether it's VDH or elections or VDACs for their uses. And then as part of the budget, you guys had approved roughly $58 million and a sum sufficient. That was expenses we'd already incurred before we knew we were getting federal funding. Those monies will now be converted to federal funding, so we're not out the funds, that those monies will be received 100% instead of a 75%, 25% reimbursement from us in the future. So roughly of the $3.3 billion that we have control over, about $878 million of that we have already found uses for, and as we move forward, we'll have additional usage as the agency requests come in and work with your teams. The last part of this presentation, has to deal with the allocation to the locality. So all of you can look on here and see the allocation to every locality in the Commonwealth And I'll point out here, all cities and counties got an allocation. Counties are responsible for towns within their borders to making sure they get their allocation. This is exactly the same way the federal authorities are allocated the money to us, and we thought it appropriate that we would allocate at least half of the monies set aside for the localities directly under the same terms. And over and above that, if there's additional distributions to localities, this happened to be on population, it could be some other metric we use. It could be on COVID cases. It could be used on some composite index. I've gotten letters from several of you. College towns are more significantly hit, and they may need more economic help. That will be something we'll work with you guys on as we go forward in making recommendations. Obviously, it's up to the governor to distribute these, but we are keeping you informed as we move through this process. Again, this is just all the various locations that add up to the 45 million that's been distributed so far. So that's a brief overview of the CARES Act. And again, we're hopeful that there are additional monies coming from the Fed. Yes, we'd love to have some directly to the state, but also what we're really concerned about is they continue to as we pull out of this, give economic help to individuals and businesses. That will make it a lesser impact on them, which will obviously help us in the long term. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that is my presentation, and I'll certainly be happy to entertain questions.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. We certainly do appreciate the thoroughness of your presentation to us this morning. And at this time, Sharon or Ann, which of you would like to guide us through the questions that members may have?
Mr. Chairman, I guess if a member has a question, if they could just speak up.
That'd be fine with me.
Any questions from the members?
Hey, Mr. Chairman, this is Kurt Cox.
Yes, sir. Delegate.
Yeah, I had a question for the Secretary.
Please. Yes, sir.
First of all, Aubrey, thanks for your hard work. You've been just a very dedicated public servant. I know we all appreciate you very much. My question's on the part of the CARES Act dealing with the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. I think that's about $66 million. And I know you're probably looking at some K-12 higher ed split. That's obviously an area I'm very interested in. I think I've written several articles on looking at OVN, et cetera. Where are y'all with that? What kind of input will we have on, I guess, that particular piece? So that's sort of my question. I think that's an area of a lot of interest for a lot of our members.
Yes, sir. Doug Cox, where we are, that is one of the requests that their governor and the executive branch, along with the legislative branch, have some discretion over the use of those funds. I know Secretary Carney has had a work group together making a recommendation for the use of those monies. That is due today. Along with all the other recommendations. And so as of right now, no decision, Delegate Cox. I'm sure a recommendation will be coming from them, which we'll work through with our policy team and the governor and keep you guys informed as to what's going on. But right now, there's been no decision officially made on the use of those monies.
Mr. Chairman, if I could follow up.
Yes.
Aubrey, how will you were mentioning, which I think is important, involving the Appropriations Committee. So what kind of input and how will that sort of work with whatever recommendations of Secretary Carney, et cetera?
Well, first of all, Dr. Cox, I would encourage you, and I've seen some of your writings, and I have passed all the requests that I've gotten that on to the Secretary and to the policy team. That's one of the things that the Department of Planning and Budget will do. We'll bring all those together when we consider an item. It will then be considered like a budget request. There will be a recommendation made to the governor, and at the end of the day, it will be the governor's decision, but I have been sharing those thought processes and getting input from the committees, and I assume that we will do the same going forward, and certainly any committee members that have comments on that, I would encourage reaching out not only to our secretary, myself, or anything, and I'll make sure those are heard again with our policy team. But at the end of the day, it will be, I guess, the governor's decision, but I hope to do that collaboratively, working with your staff and the members of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, McQuinn, and I have a couple questions I wanted to ask.
Yes, ma'am, by all means.
All right, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much again for that presentation and just giving us some insight in terms of what's going on and I guess some strategies to address it or approach whatever's coming down the pipe. I wanted to ask if there's a big elephant in the room that I hear a lot about all of the time, and that is the reopening. And once we're reopening and giving, well, you have said over and over again, just giving people, giving citizens some kind of level of confidence. But I didn't hear anything about, as we reopen, what happens if there's a resurgence, of even greater numbers, escalating numbers of this COVID virus that we really have not gotten a good handle on. I mean, from my personal perspective, we are working on it, but so many people feel that we are going back too soon. The reopening is occurring too soon, and we know that we are looking at it from several perspectives. There's health-wise, economically, and public safety. But if we find ourselves in a situation, again, how is that going to affect the economy? Whereas, there's a big resurgence, and we have to almost start all over again, trying to live through what we have lived through to this point.
Yes, ma'am. First of all, the governor, obviously that would be his ultimate decision, but he has said from the very beginning, and this is a public health crisis, but it's also an economic crisis, and you're not going to solve the economic crisis unless you get the public health crisis under control. And I think that's a view shared by many across the country, whether you're in the health profession or in the financial profession going forward. This is going to come down to not just the governor or the president or anybody else saying it's okay to go out. It's also going to be up to individual businesses and individual members of the public to determine what is in their best interest, what is going to give them confidence to go into a restaurant or to get on a plane. And that may be different for different individuals. So that's one thing, unlike a previous, I remember September 11th, people were afraid of flying. And so we were able to get over that by installing TSA, and after several months, people felt safe again. That's not going to be the way this is going to work. Every individual establishment is going to have to build that confidence for people to feel comfortable coming into them and being safe. So having said that, the governor, when he mentioned up this opening, he first of all listened to the people in Northern Virginia who said they weren't ready. Obviously, the city of Richmond said they weren't quite ready. Accomack County suggested they weren't ready. And as he pointed out, what he gave was the floor, but if people weren't ready, he was willing to listen to that and make adjustments. I think that'll be the same attitude the governor takes and his team looking forward. If there is a increase, that will be something that he will consider when he makes a decision as to whether we move from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 2 to 3, or we have to retrace some of our steps. I know the governor understands that the worst thing that for the economy is if we open too soon, we did too many things, and then we had to retrace. We don't know if there's going to be a resurgence of this virus. We know we don't have a vaccine yet. I don't suspect we're going to have one in this fiscal year, this calendar year, probably, hopefully, by the beginning of next year. Maybe we'll get some therapeutic remedies that help people go through this. But again, those are all factors I know the governor will consider, but I don't think there's anybody any more anxious to move into an economic recovery than the governor. But I am comforted that he is a doctor and understands that we only get there from the public health being taken care of. So while I don't have a specific answer to your question, I know that it is certainly the governor looking at all the data, but also assessing, as I pointed out earlier, we're able now to quantify risk. We know social distancing works. We know that wearing a mask in public does help. We know prolonged exposure in close contact is not good. So there are some things that we now know that we didn't know when this all started that could help us move and learn how to deal with this from an economic perspective as we keep in mind the public health. So I can only assert to you, Dr. Quinn, that the governor is very much aware of that. His team gives him all sides of that, and that is one of the discussion points that is heard. We're very cognizant of not making sure we don't open up too early.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Delegate Eric.
Yes, thank you. I have 3 questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Secretary Layne, for that informative presentation. I wanted to get additional feedback on how the amount allocated to each locality was determined and how the assessment will occur to determine if the amount that they were allocated were properly spent. I know you mentioned the possibility of funding being offset from other areas if it's determined that they did not properly spend those dollars. And then my last question is, I'm still a little confused around the $1 billion shortfall that has been projected and the $878 million that has already been designated of that $3.3 billion CARES funding. I guess I'm trying to figure out how that process works. Did you state that the remaining dollars from that CARES funding can't go towards that shortfall? Or how does that process work where we will take these dollars and assess all of those unallotments that occurred when we realized we were going to have a budget shortfall? I'm trying to better understand that process.
Yes. I'll answer your latter question first because just to make sure was clear, none of the CARES money can directly be used to offset our revenue loss. So of the $1 billion in revenue, none of that money can be used to offset that. That is a strict prohibition by the federal authorities. We've asked for flexibility in other funds that they have given to hospitals, they've given to private businesses. They've allowed those monies to offset revenue shortfalls. That is not the case with states and localities. It's not only it's a very political topic that's happening in the Congress right now. There are some that see that as a bailout to states from a bad behavior. I think there are lots of things we could do to offset that if that is if some people thought that. But nonetheless, where we start right now is the CARES monies cannot be used to offset the $1 billion shortfall we're going to have. Now, what it can be used for is if there are general fund expenditures that we were incurring that are eligible for CARES Fund, we can save that money. For instance, I mentioned the $58 million that we had already set aside in the budget that we were going to have to use to pay for PP&E. That now we can restore to the budget because we can use the CARES funding for that. But anything else has to be a direct result of the virus. So we can buy personal protection equipment, we can use it for testing, we can help pay social services, we can do other health emergencies that we would normally have to pay for, but we cannot use it for our revenues. So the CARES funding in no way helps us with our $1 billion shortfall, and unless there is a change from Congress. And right now, that is not on the horizon, and I would expect we should act accordingly, assuming that that's not going to happen going forward. So that's the difference between the CARES funding. It's a lot of money, And in fact, if we don't use it all for direct costs, we have to give it back by December 30th because those monies expire at the end of this calendar year, December 30th. So unfortunately, that won't help us with the $1 billion shortfall in this year, nor is it helpful if we forecast and our revenues are below the unallotted numbers. It would not allow us to have revenues to offset those because of the limitations on them. The money that we sent to the localities, Delegate Ayer, was based on population. So it was the same metric that was used for when the federal government allocated it to us, the state's total population. We used their numbers for locality to allocate those monies to them. There were those who advocated for other allocation methods. For instance, whether it was based on the amount of cases, COVID cases. There were those who advocated for the composite index. We chose population, at least for half the monies, so that we could get monies out quickly to every locality because almost all localities have had some expenses related to this. Now, there will be accounting from them, and we'll see how they use those monies. If there's another allocation to them, it may be on population, it may be on some other metric. Again, I suspect a lot of that may be back during during another session, the special session, whenever that may be, but certainly we'll keep the money committees informed of what our thoughts are as we move forward with those monies. But that's why we chose to do it on population. And again, none of those monies can offset any of our budget shortfall.
Okay. Delegate Reed.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Secretary, I have a question for the Secretary, if that's okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Layne, thanks again for your very thorough presentation. You've already answered a couple of questions I had, but one of the questions that I did have is, do you have information about the unemployment rate by region and by industry? And the reason why I'm asking is when we start thinking about the post-COVID environment as well as investments in areas, I'd like for us to be able to have the information to be able to make good decisions about where we need to be investing to help the recovery occur.
Yeah, Delegate Reed, yes. I don't personally know how to get it. Dr. Healy, and Workforce Advisor, she certainly has that. I know that Secretary of Commerce Brian Ball has been looking at these numbers as he's putting together his request from Commerce as to how we help businesses and individuals going forward, so we can get those to you. Let me tell you about one thing, though, that I'm concerned about with unemployment. We are using our unemployment insurance monies to pay this. They are funded to us by the federal government, and typically what happens is we then charge businesses the amount that is necessary for that insurance. Well, if these monies that we're receiving from the federal government now in the form of loans, which is the way they do that to keep the unemployment pot full, if they're not converted to grants, we're going to have a significant amount of increase in unemployment rate to our companies in the state at a time when they're trying to get back on their feet. So one of the things we're really advocating for is that those become grants instead of loans. Otherwise, the state is going to have to turn around and then get reimbursement from that from our companies. And we think that would also add salt to their wounds as they're coming out of this, trying to get back on their feet. So, I'll get you from Dr. Healy the information you request. I know it is available, but I also wanted to point out that is one thing that we are encouraging our congressional delegation. If there is more funding, that is one thing they keep in mind, so that those monies don't have to be repaid, and then we don't have to either take it from our general fund, which would be billions of dollars, or turn around and charge it to employers across the Commonwealth when at a time we want them to increase employment and are trying to get back on their feet.
Before I take the next question, and I think you and I spoke this morning, and there's some unemployment data that we're going to be getting out to the members. Would you comment on that, please?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Kim has been working with Jeff Ryan at VC to put together some of that information. I'm not sure we have all of that granularity, but we have a bunch of material from him that we were going to be sending out to the full committee later today.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any additional questions?
I have a question, Mr. Chair. This is Delegate Tyler.
Yes, ma'am, Delegate Tyler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary Layne, for your report. Continuing the questions along the line of Delegate Ayers, the money that's allocated to the local governing bodies to help with some of the expenses, do the localities apply for this money, or does the money go straight automatically to the county treasurer?
No, ma'am, no application. They do have to forward us a certification, the same certification the governor signed to receive the monies that said they're going to use them in compliance. But once they give that certification, the monies will be automatically sent to them. We expect that to happen around the 1st of June. But there's no application. They'll get these monies based on their population. Now that's the cities and the counties. Towns within a county must then work with their county to get the monies flowing through to them.
Okay, and a follow-up question, Mr. Chair?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, and once they receive the allocation, you said that the state was responsible for the funding, meaning that if the localities do not use the funding, then it's returned to the state?
Yes, ma'am. It's either, if they don't use it, it return to the state. The state will then determine whether or not it can use it with a qualified expenditure. If a locality uses money incorrectly, they use it for something that is not allowed under the law, then the state has the ability to offset other funds. It doesn't say we're going to actually do that, but we had to give ourselves the ability to do that because of obviously the reduction in general fund revenues that would occur if we have to settle that up. So that was the reason for putting that safeguard in. But the locality who gets the money can use it at their discretion as long as it's within the compliance of the guidelines and the laws of the CARES Act. And then at the end of that, there will be an accounting. As you recall, you may not know that there's an inspector general assigned to the CARES Act that will do audits of states and certain localities to make sure that the funds were used in compliance with their guidelines.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, thank you so very much for being with us today. We certainly appreciate your presentation and all that you guys are doing to ensure that the Virginia economy is moving along and that we are dealing with this COVID-19 the best way that we can. If there are no other questions from the members, we're going to terminate our meeting. Members, thank you so very much for getting
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Today. We appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
And everyone stay safe. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Mr.
Have a great day.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.